Well, welcome to those of you who are here with us live, and for those of you who will be tuning in on demand. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us here for another live guest interview within the Mindful Journey. I'm so incredibly excited and humbled to be joined by someone who I got introduced to years back through a mutual client and friend, Rick Kirshner. And Sarah, when I first had met her, I was just not only impressed by the depth of what she was sharing to me, which I found to be very informative, but just her desire to serve. And really, I feel fortunate that she joined us today. And so thank you, Sarah, for being here. I will go just briefly through, I think most of you who end up seeing this will have already seen her resume, and it certainly has a ton of credibility to it. But just a few things that I was intrigued by was her desire after 20 plus year in corporate law, and she worked as legal counsel or associate counsel within a number of recognizable names like the NBA, National Basketball Association, Simon and Schuster, and Reebok. And I believe for a period of time was in Europe. Is that right, Sarah? Were you in Europe? Okay, for was it 8 years?
Yeah, 8 years.
Okay. So yeah, so that obviously has some is a neat background and resume, but after 20 plus years, decided that she wanted to give it all up to teach mindfulness, as she had experienced some anxieties in her own life and felt that she would be doing a great service to the world by allowing all of us to benefit from her teaching. So with all that being said, we'll talk a little bit more about her story through the questions asked. But again, Sarah, thank you so much for being here, and I'm looking forward to our time spent together.
You're very welcome. It's great to be here.
Yeah, great. Well, so let's just dive right into it. You know, we're in the mindful journey, so inherently all of our discussions have an emphasis on some element of mindfulness. And with that, what does it mean to be mindful? What is mindfulness?
Great question. There are many definitions out there and sort of different ways of stating it, but ultimately, I like to think of mindfulness as kind of a two-part definition, which is so simple in many ways. I mean, really, it's about paying attention to the present moment and without judgment or criticism. Those are kind of the two halves. I think a lot of people remember the paying attention to the present moment, which seems so simple, and they forget about this without judgment or criticism. So I always emphasize both parts and kind of spend a couple moments on both parts when I talk about what mindfulness is, at least to me in my life. And I think when you think about kind of some of the work that's out there and just how our lives play out and how our minds work, you understand why actually, even though it's so simple, it's actually not so easy to do. Both halves of the definition are not so easy. So the first half, which is paying attention to the present moment, there was a very famous study done by Harvard researchers a number of years ago where they had people, and a lot of people in their study who had handheld devices or phones, and they checked in with them multiple times during the day and asked them where their minds were. Were their minds on what they were trying to focus on, their meeting or their conversation, their class, or were their minds wandering? And the big kind of takeaway was that about 50% of the time, the average person's mind is wandering. That's a very, very large percent. And when I teach people, they often say, I say, how often do you think your mind is wandering? And when I teach, often, particularly lawyers and other people who are very high pressured achievers, they often raise their hand and say 80%, 90%, yeah. Which I think is really kind of actually almost kind of scary, because lawyers are charging by the 6-minute increment for their time. And if their mind is wandering off the client, then it's really kind of, could be questionable to justify the amount that they're charging. But this is the reality of our lives. Our minds are wandering all the time. And if you start the part of what mindfulness is just observing your own mind, treating your mind as the laboratory in your own scientific experiment, and starting to understand where your mind goes, because our minds tend to go over and over to the same places. And that's useful information because, in fact, our minds tend to focus more on the negative than the positive. And that can be, have a real impact on our lives, especially when we're worriers, which many of us are.
Sure.
And so that's sort of the first half of mindfulness. The second half is to do this without being highly critical of yourself when your mind wanders, because given that the definition is that that the studies have found that our minds wander at least 50% of the time. If when you're trying to practice focusing your mind on the present moment, on whatever that might be, whether it's your breath or sounds or many different objects of focus, as your mind starts to wander, if you start judging yourself and saying, I'm a failure, I wasn't able to stay focused, then you're actually likely to not progress as much as if you can let go and be gentle with yourself and realize, like, this is what the human mind does. And this is part of mindfulness, is to wander. The goal of mindfulness is not to not wander. It's to observe whatever is happening in the present moment. And there are many, I love teaching with analogies, and there are many analogies that people use, but one of my favorites around this concept of kind of the fact that part of mindfulness is to not be too critical of yourself, which as an achiever, like, and many people out there like myself, it's actually really hard to not be critical, not to have that self-critic voice going off and saying, oh, you did it wrong, you're a failure. And so a number of years ago, we got a puppy because my daughter really, really loves dogs, and I never had a dog. And so, it was kind of scary to me, a puppy. I have no idea. I've got 4 children, but how am I going to deal with a puppy? But in fact, we got someone to help us try to understand how you train a puppy so the puppy doesn't wander away all the way. And you teach the puppy, you say, come, and you try to get the puppy to come, and sit and stay. These are like some of the basic commands I learned right away. And in fact, you realize that if you get mad at the puppy, you aren't going to get mad at the puppy for wandering away. It's just what a puppy does.
Yes.
And you typically just want to be kind to the puppy and compliment the puppy for coming, but not get all mad at the puppy for wandering away. And that's how you train a puppy. So it's sort of a fun analogy. If you are finding yourself getting mad at yourself for failing in mindfulness, you can realize how you might treat a puppy or a young child. So that's a little bit, probably more than you wanted, about the definition of what it is to be mindful.
No, that's fantastic. And I think analogies are so critical to our ability to absorb information and to learn. So that's the first time I heard that analogy. And I struggle with that like everyone else, because you're so right. We're naturally wired as people to shun ourselves. It's like we want to practice mindfulness and just sit alone in some peace and solitude, or go for a walk, or whatever the case may be, to try to recalibrate and just be at peace and at calm. And then when we don't feel that inherent calm, it's almost like, well, see, I told you can't do it. You can't be calm. So that analogy is perfect, Sarah. Now, let me ask you, is there anything, because I've struggled with this from a standpoint of, okay, so now that you're aware of you don't want to be mean to yourself, how can you get back to focus? Is there anything, or is it just convincing your mind to just be aware of the fact that you're being mean to yourself, and that will help you get back to focus?
I mean, there's no one way to do this, but really an important part of mindfulness, and this leads to another analogy that I love to use, because I'm an athlete and I played squash at Brown and just have always done a lot of sport. When you are training for a soccer match or for a 5K run, you don't think about, oh, I'm going to run that race. I mean, it actually is quite useful to think through the race in your head. There are benefits to that. And you see athletes do that in many ways. They're sort of rehearsing their ski race or whatever it is before they actually go out. But you need to practice. You actually need to practice. And so you need to train the muscles in your body and get them stronger. And actually the muscles in your brain are the biggest muscles in your body. And similarly, you need to practice. So there's no kind of easy way out like we often look for and hope we can find with mindfulness. It's not like you just think you're mindful and tell people you're mindful and become mindful. It's actually kind of a daily practice. And the way I like to teach practice is sort of 2 pathways to practice. One is kind of like going to the gym and practicing. And for me, the morning is the easiest time to practice, because once you get into your day, it's hard to know if you'll have that time. And it's easier to
Mhm,
have your thinking brain come up with excuses why you've got to get something done for work,
mhm,
or,
mhm,
something else has gotten in the way. You've got to answer more emails. But if you wake up first thing in the morning, if you normally wake up at, let's say, 7 or 6, and you can set your alarm 5 or 10 minutes earlier than you normally do, then you can set up a daily practice of kind of a sitting meditation,
mhm,
where that's kind of like you're training, the muscles, the
mhm,
mindful muscles. And there's really nothing to substitute for it. And there is, people say to me, how long do I need to meditate? What's the magic number? And there is no magic number of like, it has to be 2 minutes or 10 minutes or 20 minutes.
mhm.
But it's more that if you do practice longer, you tend to have, see more impact. But
Yep.
actually practicing every day is more important than practicing longer times
Mhm,
irregularly.
mhm,
And, I think you can, 5 minutes less if that's really, really hard for you, maybe 10 minutes. And there are many, many apps and guided meditations. And what they'll do is they will guide your attention to focus on a particular object of attention. Again, it's things, simple things like your breath, because you're always breathing, or
mhm,
listening to sounds, just as examples. And then they will remind you that your mind will be wandering off, and remind you to bring your mind back, which is helpful when you're first starting. And then as you progress and practice more, you can actually, you probably will want eventually to turn the sound off and just to let your mind be silent.
mhm.
And, you'll just notice basically that you'll notice when your mind wanders off. Sometimes you won't. Some days you'll sit down and your mind will wander the entire time. And then I set usually an alarm to remind me that the amount of time I wanted to sit is over, because we do have other things to do in our day.
Sure,
And
sure.
that might go off, and you have a bell you can set it to or whatever, and you realize that your mind has been wandering the whole time. So it's never the same from day to day, but actually sitting and practicing really helps you. And then the other kind of practice that I really recommend is this kind of like mindfulness in action, is what I call it. And that's where you're going to be practicing for little mindful pauses right in the middle of your busy day.
Mm,
And I think the thing, the truth of the matter, again, we tend to want easy fixes, but if you
sure.
just do these mindful pauses without the kind of regular sitting practice, you know, it's 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 important, it's helpful to have that, to practice every day with the sitting practice as well as doing the mindful pauses. And the pauses, you can set yourself reminders through your device, through little post-its, any kind of reminder when you do certain things every day. It might be brushing your teeth, it might be having that first sip of coffee, it might be as you eat your meal, because you can eat mindfully. It might be as you're having a conversation with your child, you can listen mindfully. And
Mhm.
just pick, you don't want to try to do it with everything in your life, because it's just not, you've got to go on with your life and
Yeah.
get your work done. But at the same time, if you pick a few things, you can really find that you can start to build this, so that when something stressful arises,
Mhm,
then you're more able to take a pause and reset yourself. And
mhm,
that's really, really valuable. So it's not, another analogy is kind of people who try to diet. They don't see themselves losing weight every single day usually, but then suddenly they're at a new level. And I feel the same way with this practice. Like, I don't see change every single day, but when I'm practicing consistently and regularly, suddenly my husband or my child will say something that used to upset me, and I'm
doesn't upset you
calm.
anymore. Yeah, yeah.
And it's kind of magical. So that's kind of the way it works.
That's fantastic insight. So with that, Sarah, and you kind of already have answered this through all of that in such great insight. But is there a feeling people should expect to receive when you're mindful, or is it just being aware of what you're feeling?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there really is no one answer to this. It's a very personal, it's personal to each, to how, you yourself feel. But there are some things that are, that you can kind of say about this or generalize a little bit. So um, people often, there's a term in out in the world, especially in the athletic world, that is called the zone, which is similar. It's the same idea as being mindful. It's when you are, and so for me, these kind of mindful moments are when I'm the most unself-conscious and truly present. And during those times, I'm really able to note, I find I'm able to notice details. I'm able to focus on what I'm focusing on. So I've got this amazing focus.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, I have incredible peripheral vision where I'm able to see all sorts of things around me that I would not normally notice because my head would be darting around, being distracted.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a really useful thing. I'll get into it a little bit later as we talk about like professional and in my actual job as a lawyer, how I might use mindfulness, but it's a really useful skill to be able to do that. And so Michael Jordan, he was a big practitioner of mindfulness. And one of the things he said is when he was in the zone, he was able to dribble the ball toward the basket, like with incredible focus and confidence that the ball was going in the basket. But at the same time, he could see every opponent, see where they were moving, what they were doing. It was as if time was kind of slowing down.
Wow.
And you're relaxed and focused and efficient. And it's a pretty wonderful space. I mean, so I bet almost everyone has been in the zone at times. It might be, for example, children when they play tend to be in the zone. So we've all done it when we were younger. We kind of somehow lose that as we get older, but it's something quite innate. And if you can spend time with a young child and get down and play Legos with them or trains or whatever, you can see how in the moment. I love the way little boys like to lie on their stomach and then look at the trains, because somehow that makes it them bigger and more real to them. And girls similar, girls can do that too, but
Yes.
it's just it's just
naturally more fascinated with trains.
What?
I said boys are naturally more
Yes.
fascinated with trains. I get it.
I mean, I have boys and girls, and so there was a little bit of that, but I think that it's a wonderful feeling. It's one of those feelings where if you typically find yourself in the midst of your day, a little bored, a little bit like, oh, when is this day ending? How am I getting through this? And then at other times you're engaged in a meeting, you're in a conversation with someone who you really click with, and suddenly an hour has gone by and you can't even believe it, or, sort of, you just get lost in time. That's the feeling. And some people feel that more with their passion, like musicians might feel it when they kind of are playing a piece of music. It just feels right in their body, and athletes obviously as well. So
it almost sounds like you're just like what you're describing is that folks aren't worried about the outcome, like you mentioned before, that it's kind of singular focus on being in that moment without without distraction of what does he think of me or what does she think of me or any internal angst. It's just we're living in this moment. As a result of being in this moment, there is no other moment. Right. And I like how you're breaking it down for us pretty simply. But these analogies are great for me because I learn through pictures. I feel like I'm a visual learner personally. I think a lot of folks who will hear this are probably as well. So those analogies are perfect. Now, Sarah, with the expert's mind and the beginner's mind in mindfulness, I'm sure you've heard this before, but something struck me years ago. I read this quote somewhere, and it said that in an expert's mind, the possibilities are limited. In the beginner's mind, the possibilities are limitless. And that when I read that, it was profound because I just thought, wow, what have I shown up in my life as a quote unquote expert as that has disallowed me to experience the fullness of now, but has also disallowed me to learn new things because I quote unquote think I already accomplished it. So I say all that to now ask you, can you think of a time when you have operated with an expert's mind and where it might have impacted you in your career?
Okay, well, that's a great question again. And I have to say, since I practiced law for over 30 years and it was all based on my expertise as a lawyer, that, being as a lawyer, being an expert is absolutely a key part of being effective. So I don't want to put down the expert mind, but I think, in fact, what I find in my life is that I experience both the expert's mind, and because I practice mindfulness, the beginner's mind kind of regularly. And sometimes, quite often I alternate between the two. So I think that what you're referring to, while you do need to, develop an expertise as a lawyer and bring that to the table to your clients, sometimes in life, when you have this kind of, as you said, a narrow expert lens, you can find that you just miss out on possible solutions that are right there in front of you, because you're focused on you bring your narrow lens to the table. And so for me as a lawyer, and actually also kind of funnily in a way, as a mother of now 4 teenagers, although one just turned 20, one just became 13. So I've been calling them teenagers for a while because they're all in that teenage zone. My daughter was kind of a teenager at 12, but now my son at 20 is still kind of a teenager. But with teenagers, this skill of bringing a beginner's mind is actually equally important and very, very valuable, because teenagers don't always tell you the truth, and they don't always level with you, and you probably don't always level with them. But when I was a lawyer, one of the big things I spent time doing was negotiating corporate deals. Mm-hmm. And I find myself negotiating with my teenage children quite regularly. So it's kind of funny how it comes around.
Yes.
But, when I would prepare for negotiations as a lawyer, you would study the facts of the deal that I was doing deals, not negotiating settlements to litigation, which you also negotiate there. But, I would learn about the deal, and I would learn about what exactly were all the arguments in favor of what we wanted to accomplish for our client. But if you go into a negotiation and you're just focused on your expert lens and exactly all your arguments, you can miss literally everything. Because if you walk into a negotiation, into the room with this beginner's mind kind of openness and curiosity about what is there in the room, this is kind of a mindful zone-like presence. It's amazing what you can learn and discover. So you might, by paying attention to what the other side is really saying, by their body language, by the energy they're giving off, you might figure out that you really care about X, but they really care about Y. And the more complex the negotiation, the more kind of variables at play, the more you have the possibility to come up, what they say in law and some of the books we read, like Getting to Yes, et cetera, is you have the ability to possibly even grow the pie. So it's not like you're just dividing a small pie. You can make the pie bigger, because if actually they're fearful about other things that actually don't worry you, and they want things that you don't want, you might actually come up with solutions that you never would have thought of until you actually were in the room with them and you could see and listen to them and see their body language. But then you might say, oh, wow, we could actually come up with this solution. And everyone, it's not that everyone's always going to be fully happy, like a perfect, Disney World solution, but it means that actually there are these solutions that are really pretty wonderful that you might have missed out on if you weren't open to it. And similarly, I would say, as a mother of teenagers, one of the problems that I can have, and other parents sometimes have, is we talk too much. And so especially maybe as women, we talk too much sometimes, but we just talk, and you don't listen to what the child has to say. And in fact, if you can just be quiet, and they won't speak usually if you're just talking, and they're more shy to speak, most of them. And this varies child to child, obviously, or teenager. But I mean, if you can have the discipline just to sit there, put out a question and then just sit there, you can learn a lot from their body language. They might actually share things that they never would have shared. And you can come up with different solutions to the ever-changing problems of being a parent of teenagers. So
I love that. Even when you just said that, your tone changed, and you said, if you just sit there, and it's almost like that pause, and it just put me at a sense of ease. And I'm thinking, if you're in a negotiation, especially in a room full of type A personalities who are trying to get the best desired outcome for, their respective organization, everybody feels like they need to be, ready to go, ready to fire. But to your point, I mean, I just felt it right now by just the pause of just, being present. And so that's definitely great insight. And with the beginner's mind, though, Sarah, is there anything that you can do to help you get there? I mean, sometimes people naturally, we know, there are people who are very type A and ego driven, and you hear in medicine a lot of times some of the reasons why surgeries go awry is because of this very idea that a doc is unwilling or surgeon is unwilling to see outside the scope of what is. They've been doing it the same way, and almost are operating on autopilot. So with all of that being said,
Mhm.
is there anything that like we can do to help us be a beginner again?
Yeah. So you're kind of setting me up with these questions, which is great. But like, and in some ways, I'm going to sound like a broken record
No.
because mindfulness has so many teachings actually, and so many valuable, lessons about life and so much wisdom. But at the same time, underneath it all is a really simple, basic starting point, which is practice. So if you practice these mindful pauses where you're doing your practice, in the morning, or it could be at night, it could be different times of day where you're doing your kind of going to the gym sitting practice. And then you practice taking mindful pauses at different moments, like right before an important meeting. You take 1 deep breath or 3 deep breaths, or you bring your attention to your feet and just pause before starting the meeting. But after all the chit chat that happens as you're kind of just everyone's arriving, you take a pause. It could be a formal pause where you announce that you're going to be taking a pause that everyone's going to engage in and you're in the room, or it could just be you do it on your own with your eyes open and no one knows you're doing it. And so if you practice, you're more likely to create a habit. It's about habits of mind.
Yes.
And again, much of mindfulness is just observing our own habits as if it's the most important laboratory of our lives.
Yes.
And discovering where our mind usually is going, because our minds do tend to go to the same place over and over. It's actually really fascinating to start understanding your mind. And the benefit is that you can then learn to gently, like a puppy, nudge your mind back to where you want it to be rather than where it's going. So similar to when your mind is wandering, you just kind of gently bring it back to the person you're listening to, the food that you're eating and wanting to taste, as opposed to not even, ending the meal and not even having any recollection of what you just ate.
Yes. I've been guilty of that.
Yeah, we all have. And, so again, for the beginner's mind, it's about practicing this kind of like reset pause. So when you notice yourself getting into this narrow lane of this is how I'm solving the problem, you take a little break, you reset, and it can be not a lot of time. And then you open yourself up to looking at other possibilities. And again, another thing to sort of a story that I think, just a little kind of example in my life is I think about the times when, for example, I don't know, as a mother of all these kids, and one of them is calling me right now. So sorry about that. I need to turn that off.
Being mindful, right?
He's calling me from college in St. Louis. But anyway, so as you are, now I completely lost my train of thought. What was I saying? Is that you reset yourself and you practice kind of taking it in. So sometimes I forget where I left the keys in my house. I lose things in my own house.
Yes.
I go into a room in my house. I can't remember why I walked up there into one of my children's rooms when I get there. And then you lose something and you're going crazy because you can't find it. It might be your wallet. And then you go and you just take the dog out for a walk, or you take a shower and you kind of relax, just settle. And you think, oh, I didn't look there. It comes to you, and then you look and it's right there. It's a place that, like, in kind of the stress of the moment, you hadn't thought of. So that's kind of what it's like to train yourself, even as you are in your expert place in your job, to take a deep breath and be open to other possibilities without forfeiting the benefits of being an expert, which I have to always say, because I am trained as a lawyer, and that's why people hire us to do what we do. So
Sure. No, that makes sense. That's well said, Sarah. Definitely. Well, shifting gears just a little bit, and I did, as I reflecting back on my introduction, I failed to share what you do now fully. I think folks have grasped or will grasp through our conversation that you're the CEO of the Really Mindful Group, but you walked away from a career in law, which I did share, but your upbringing was Ivy League, law degree from Harvard Law, executive MBA from Duke, and then, an undergrad from Ivy League as well at Brown. And I share all that now, and I wish I would have on the front end, because with that is an inherent pressure that oftentimes comes along. Was that fair to say, as Ivy League students, is there an inherent pressure that you feel to perform because those among you are all type A? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that is a really great question. Because in fact, especially when I worked in a corporate law firm where we were charging these high rates for every 10th of an hour, which is every 6 minutes, as someone who came in with this resume of Ivy League and Harvard Law School, et cetera, and knowing that my time was being charged at this high rate, I felt incredible pressure. And I know, many other lawyers, especially young lawyers, feel the same, that you can't really afford to make a mistake, is how you feel, because, how can you when this is the rate that you're being charged at? So that can be very, very stressful. And so, on top of the stress of just having a large amount of client matters that you're juggling and working long hours, all of that, you have this stress that you have to be perfect, that you can't make mistakes. And that can be debilitating. I mean, for some people, it's enough to really make them have to leave that setting. And I did leave working in a corporate firm and went in-house, which is what many lawyers do. It often allows you to have a bit more balance if you want to have a family. Yeah. I didn't do it because I couldn't handle the pressure of, making a mistake. It was more just, interesting to me to get closer to the business, especially entertainment businesses were kind of fun and exciting. But I would say that, yeah, there's a lot of pressure. And so for me, when I was practicing law, I've always been a big athlete, and kind of exercise and fitness has been a part of my life. So when I was in school, college and law school, I would exercise in the afternoon after classes to reset myself before sitting down to study. It was a great way, like, have all your classes, go work out, go to the gym, go to dinner, and then come and sit down and start doing your work. It really kind of reset my mind. But then as I discovered mindfulness, which I really discovered at Harvard Law School, I took a yoga class because I knew that I needed relief from the stress. And I was running and playing squash and doing different forms of exercise, but it was pretty early for yoga, but I saw this opportunity to go take a yoga class at the undergrad, and I went and did it. And the woman was very mellow in the class, and she said, I think we're just going to lie down in shavasana, which is lying on the ground in what they call corpse pose, just lying on your back, and we're just going to breathe for 45 minutes. And in the moment, I thought, like, oh wow, this is not where I need to be. I need to have exercised, because I'm not going to have time to go to the gym after this class. And now I'm just going to lie here for 45 minutes. But as I lay there, and she kind of guided me toward just paying attention to the breath coming in and out of our body as we were lying on the floor, I gave into it. And it was really amazing, because as I walked back to law school, I felt literally like I was almost floating a little bit, like I was so light. It was as if all this weight had been lifted kind of out of my body, this stress, this weight, and I was kind of lighter footed heading back to school, to dinner. And I ended up finding that this was really, really, these practices of, whatever form of meditation or mindfulness, and yoga is one of them as well, are very powerful practices. And in some ways, now I exercise and practice, but if I had to pick one, it would be tough, but I might pick the meditation, because I truly feel like it brings me to a deeper place of calm.
Mm.
and it's extremely helpful.
So
So
now, when you were in the hustle and bustle of corporate America, you were already still practicing some of this because you'd had, but you think, I'm sure that you've practiced more since transferring into your entrepreneurial career. Is that right?
yes,
And
for
and with
sure.
and with that, do you think if you were back in the hustle and bustle of corporate America and in boardrooms negotiating deals, et cetera, that you would change, how it is that you'd shown up then? Would you do more mindfulness practice, or were you already doing enough? I'm just kind of curious, as because some of our listeners will be immersed in the day-to-day operations of running businesses, leaders of companies, whatever the case may be, and just trying to see if there's a tool or something that you could recommend that would maybe help.
Yeah. So I think, I mean, the world has changed tremendously since I worked. In fact, when I left the corporate world in 2014, I remember talking to various kind of mentors and friends who are leaders in this world of mindfulness. And they were saying, you know what, the yoga kind of studio business and world is very saturated, but the mindfulness world, it's like a huge wave that's just breaking. You are not too late for this movement. And I do think that I have watched it, I mean, literally explode in terms of how the size of this movement, this business, the people like me going into companies and law firms and schools and teaching these practices, people, the apps, the digital practices. There's so many possibilities, and so many companies are offering this, especially because there's, at the same time as this kind of like growth of opportunities, because there are so many people out there in the working world who are suffering from the stress. There are also there are just, companies are realizing, there are reports, for example, by the American Bar Association about the astonishing rise of suicides and depression among lawyers. And I'm sure there's similar reports in many fields.
Yes.
So that is driving companies to invest in trainings and offering trainings, which never were offered when I was there. So it is a very different world. And then on top of that, there are all these apps you can do on your phone that you can just do, if you have insomnia in the middle of the night, you can do it if you're having a stressful thing that just arises suddenly. There's more, it's almost confusing. There's so many options. So, what I suggest is playing around with it, trying some things, and then finding what resonates with you, because for sure there are as many flavors of mindfulness and meditation as there are, any kind of ice cream flavor that you want to find. And, it's about finding the right fit for you.
Yeah, that's good insight. Are there anything? So I think we've talked in previous conversations, so folks should be aware of some of these, but like Headspace and Calm application. Are there any others I can put a note out into the community just so that people have some resources? Are there any other applications you're aware of that you'd recommend?
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the ones that's been around forever and ever that I actually have on I'll pull my phone out. I have a kind of a folder. My son's organized my stuff, and I have a meditation folder, and it has right now, let's see, it has like more than 10 apps in it.
Wow.
But one of the original ones is Insight Timer, which I like because it's free and it has probably literally millions, but certainly thousands and thousands of different teachers and recordings. They do almost all the free apps these days also have paid premium versions. So, that's something that's just become, these companies need to make money. There's 10% Happier, which is based up here in Boston where I am, which is another app where they provide these kind of courses. That's quite just a different kind of way of teaching. There's Bright Mind, which is one that I've been using lately. I play around with many different apps and I kind of move around. There's one called Smiling Mind out of Australia, which particularly focuses on children, which I've found quite useful with my kids. there's just almost an endless amount.
Okay, no,
Yeah.
those are
Calm
great.
is another big one.
Those are great. Yeah, I use a Calm for the guided meditation myself, and I found that to be easy. But I was just curious if there are other resources. Everyone likes to, variety is always good, just to see
Yeah.
it's not a one size fits all. So super.
Yeah.
Well, shifting gears just a little bit again, I'd like to, as I told you on the front end before jumping into this, when you agreed to do the interview with me, one of the second things that I tried to get out of every interview is, the person who's being interviewed to share something vulnerable that they've gone through in their own life. Because I believe as people, well, first of all, we've all gone through something. We've all had
Hmm.
challenges, whether it be relational, financial, health, etc. And sometimes I believe people think that other people are perfect. So, what I have found is that when I hear stories of others who have navigated adversity successfully, whatever that may mean, success from a standpoint of just navigating it on the other side and still having happiness and fulfillment, etc., that I inherently find the strength and courage to get through what I'm going through too. So I say all that to say, Sarah, could you share with us something that you've overcome in your life that has been particularly difficult or painful for you when dealing with it?
Okay, so I'm going to share two things. They're slightly different. One is just something that just happened to me in my life, that I think when you had said to me, what's the most challenging thing in your life? This probably is the most challenging. But it's from a long time ago. And then I'll share something more recent. So when I was about to start my sophomore year of college over Labor Day weekend, my parents went to Vienna, Austria my dad was a lawyer also, for an International Bar Association meeting. My dad got there to the hotel and went for like a run, like I always do, to sort of, my mom took a nap,
Mhm.
and my dad never came back to the hotel room. And then my mom learned, I don't know, that night, that she basically, someone came to her and gave her a bag of bloody clothes and said that he'd been hit by a trolley car, which had hit his left side of his brain. So which is responsible for reasoning and language.
Mm.
And so my dad basically never recovered. He lived for another 8 years, but his language was garbled. He went from being the founder and partner of a law firm in New York City where we live to being needing daily assistance.
Mm.
And probably nothing has rocked my boat like that in my life. And I was pretty young, so I wasn't per se practicing even yoga at that point. But what I found in terms of coping with it was that in many ways, I did become much more mindful. It's just what happens in these moments of crisis where my family, my siblings, I had 3 siblings, and then my mother, we all drew together in this incredible way. And all of the kind of more peripheral stresses and worries for me, making sure I got straight A's, I was at Brown, like that everything was just lined up perfectly in my life with all my activities, that all kind of you know, became kind of blurry and hazy. It didn't mean I didn't suddenly do well, but my focus was being present for my father, for my mother, for my siblings, for my family. And we all kind of came together in this. It's just amazing how people do come together at times like that. Everyone just kind of, their ego kind of drops, and you're focused
Mhm.
on being there.
Yeah.
And it was an 8-year time when we helped each other. We helped my mother take care of my father. And then eventually when he died, it was it was really sad, but it was also very peaceful. And I
Mm.
remember after he died, and then kind of, 6 months later or something, thinking that I kind of missed in a way something about that time, because during that time, all the stuff that you really shouldn't be worrying about, it all just kind of melts away. And the most important things in life, which are the relationships and the moment, are there, and you really are more present. And then as you grieve and you kind of come back into more normal life patterns, you find that you let yourself get caught up in the drama and, all these different things that, for me, my girlfriend drama was just kind of like just not a part of my life during that time. So that was a very powerful time that I think in some ways was like a mini introduction to mindfulness through life without the philosophy and teachings in any particular way.
Yeah.
And then I would say for me, the transition from over 20 years as a lawyer and feeling like this was my identity, I was like a lawyer, mother, whatever,
Yeah.
to leaving the law and deciding that I was going to do something that was quite scary that I'd wanted to do. I'd been a lawyer thinking like, I want to focus on mindfulness, and I would make that part of my goals with my boss. And I
Yeah.
did these mentoring circles with women in my company, but it's very scary. You know, I had a very stable paycheck and I had this reputation as a lawyer and all my legal resume. It's very scary to go out there and just, you know, start from scratch.
Yeah.
So that was a scary time. And I think I had to kind of grieve myself, my identity. And I kind of feel like, you know, I told my kids, and I came home, I was working at Reebok, and then I wasn't going to be working at Reebok. And then I kind of feel like I cried for a few days, like
Mhm.
when they were at school, because I didn't really want to, you know, I didn't do that right in front of them, but
Right.
just kind of grieved and cried. And actually, it was very comforting in some ways to have a children, because they were much younger then, and I'll never forget. I was kind of like, well, I'm not going back to my office. I'm not going back to Reebok. I'm leaving. And they kind of said, Mom, can we wear Nike? Can we wear Under Armour? Because there was a strict prohibition on wearing competitive product when we worked at
Okay.
Reebok. And so they're like, Mom, do you think maybe you want to work for like the Patriots or something? So that was very refreshing to me. And I had to explain to them that actually I was leaving that and I really wanted to follow my passion. And that was, you know, it took them a little longer to understand. But again, it's about just letting go of your ego
Mm.
um, and just being present. I really wanted to do this in my heart for a
Yeah.
long time, and I was scared to do it. And when I finally did it, I have an analogy there too, which is that I literally feel like I had gone into an office for so many years during the day, and I felt a little bit like I'm a real movement kind of person. I could do exercise, I could play tennis, I could run, swim laps, play tennis like in one day. But basically I I felt like I was kind of a caged bird in this office, and suddenly I went into becoming an entrepreneur, and
Yeah.
it was like the cage door was open and I could fly, and
Yeah.
I just have been flying ever since. So, but it just took a little while to like deal with the transition.
Yeah. Well, thank you for being vulnerable and sharing. I've known you for a few years now. Of course, I never knew that story about your dad. So, thank you for sharing. I personally took a lot out of both of those, and that is just having this presence is what I took from those two stories. I know other people will kind of decode it as it fits their life, but for 8 years, it sounds as though you were maybe more aware and intentional of your moments than you'd ever been until you
Mhm.
found mindfulness. Of course, now you're operating with this awareness and presence in the day to day. But then secondarily, when you transition away from corporate law, just having that opportunity to grieve with self, I think, is powerful. To just be in the moment. I don't think we do that. Um, we got a comment. Someone said that was a beautiful story. So. Uh,
Thank you.
yeah, so it is that was great, Sarah. Thank you for sharing. And yeah, the entrepreneurship thing I can relate to. My story is comparable in that regard. Obviously, I didn't have kids who I had to worry about still being able to support. I know you're married as well, but anyways, thank you for sharing that. So can you tell us, what it was like? And I know I didn't share this with you on the front end, but I kind of like to know personally what it was like being immersed in that corporate law world. Just what was it like to, if you would have come into that world and said, "Hey, I'm going to practice mindfulness here today. We're going to do a mindfulness session for 30 minutes." Would people have looked at you like, what are you talking about? We're not doing that.
I mean, I think, as I said, the world has changed a huge amount. There's much more acceptance of these practices. And I mean, my one regret in some ways is, as me as the entrepreneur pitching companies and businesses where I often have friends who are leaders there. My friends who are leaders often introduce me to someone in HR, and then I pitch them. They don't give me the work, but they often say, I'm going to give this training to the more younger associates who are so, they're working so hard. We're going to give it. And I always kind of tease them and say, no, we need to be training you and your senior team. And for them, it's hard, the senior leaders. Now, in some places, there are senior leaders who get it, who actually practice yoga, practice mindfulness, practice meditation. And we kind of refer to them as champions. Like, if you can find a champion at a company who really believes in this, that's incredibly helpful to being able to work with the company to bring in some of these practices that maybe can shift culture. But I think that it's a hard place out there. I mean, so I bring my trainings. Some people are much more drawn to these practices than others. So it's always a mixture of people who are really passionate about it. Some people come just to try it once, and then they're just too busy. It's not their priority. Others are really drawn to it and say to me, oh, when can I leave the law firm and go, and go teach? And I'm like, well, I don't want to be the person bringing you away from the company when I'm bringing you. So I'm very careful about that as well. That's not my goal, but
Right.
You find all sorts of different people. So I think there's a lot more room in the corporate world, and it's different. Also with COVID, obviously things have changed so much because so many people have worked from home, and in home, you do have more ability to create these breaks because you're not just down some people are in open office space, et cetera. So it's changed a lot, but I think what I still hear when I teach at these law firms is that, and at companies, investment banks and companies, is that it can be a real grind and a lot of pressure. And just saying, oh, we're going to give them a mindfulness practice is probably not enough to truly change it. It really can make a difference, but you've got to find the right balance for you. And you have to find a place that that's a good fit for you. And, sometimes I do find some of the younger people that I train say, it's just, I can't work here. It's too difficult. I feel too much pressure. And I always feel like saying, you have the choice. You have, first of all, the choice on what to focus on and whether to focus on the positive or the negative, and, to sort of complain about what you have, but try to build in mechanisms that make it more workable for you. And then ultimately you do have the choice about where you want to go and, what type of work is right for you. What's a good fit?
Yes.
So.
That's interesting and good to hear that it's kind of, from your perspective, it's seemingly more accepted in corporate America now from when you were immersed in it in the day to day, because our world now more than ever before is in dire need of mindfulness. And of course, you and I are biased because this is an element of our work, but I've seen the benefits of it in my own life. And with all that being said, there are still folks nonetheless who are out there hurting, even with mindfulness practices, people who have lost jobs, people who are going through health concerns, people who may be going through financial challenges or through divorce or relationship issues. And those people may feel this element of hopelessness, Sarah. They may feel as though they're at their wits' end. For anyone who may be listening now or when this is on demand, who feels as though in fact they're at their wits' end, and they just, they're hearing you, they're hearing the tactics, but they're not absorbing, what would your message be to them?
I mean, it's a great question, and it's a hard one because it's very personal. So every person's story is different. The solution is slightly different for everybody. But I come back to the fact that in my, first of all, a very simple lesson that my dad taught us before he had his accident, which I live with every day. And it's extremely helpful because he was in this very pressureful world of setting up a law firm and needing to make ends meet to support his family in New York City. And so stress was a part, of his life, and we witnessed it as kids. We didn't know if the door was going to close gently or slam closed when he came home, based on what kind of day he had, and
Yeah.
what it was going to be like. So I lived with that growing up. And one of the lessons he taught, which I found really helpful, was, tomorrow's a new day. And that to me is so hopeful in many ways. Of He would say, if every, and he loved these certain, I don't know, lessons that he would instill in us. And again, this one was, if the world seems to be closing in on you, if you just feel like you can't do it, consider trying to, and this isn't practical at 2 p.m. necessarily, but consider just going to bed early, trying to get a good night's sleep, which of course these days with insomnia, whatever, it's not
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
easy. Although
Right.
mindfulness and body scans, things we didn't even get into, can really help with that. And see if tomorrow you can wake up and kind of give it a fresh start. And I really do believe, just as I did resetting myself from a lawyer, which was, I had a great life, but there were a lot of stress in that, to doing what I really love, what, you've reset your life as well. There really is a possibility to find optimism. And I do think that this practice can be literally a lifesaver. And John Kabat-Zinn, who's one of my mentors, who really is one of the original Americans that went to Europe, into Asia, and kind of found these Buddhist practices and brought it back to the US, but kind of took the religion out of it and created these mindfulness-based stress reduction trainings. His focus was the hospitals, because he was a doctor.
Mm-hmm.
And what he really, like, his initial laser focus was on patients who came to the end of the medical system, where the medical system said, we've tried the surgeries, we've tried everything we can, and we don't know what to do for you next.
Mm-hmm.
With your pain, with, some people have pain that just never goes away. And some
Right.
people have, medical problems that they just can't see to solutions.
Right.
And his point was that you can practice these mindfulness-based stress reduction practices, these mindfulness meditation practices, and you can find relief. There's a lot of studies that you can find relief from pain that never goes away. And it's counterintuitive in a way, because much of that is actually focusing on the pain, paying attention to the pain,
Mm-hmm.
and noticing that the pain is rarely constant. I mean, this is one of the great insights of Buddhism, is that everything is changing all the time, which can induce suffering in people when we want everything to stay the same and it's always changing. But also, if you don't like the way things are, you can take comfort that it will change. And you start noticing that actually pain ebbs and flows, and you can find relief in those moments when it's ebbing. And if you are at the wit's end in your job, you might, by just sitting quietly and finding the space, you might find solutions that you didn't think of. And that's not to say that there are people who really, it's harder to find those solutions. So I don't want to minimize any of that. It's not like there's this sort of solution to everything kind of thing.
Sure,
But
sure.
there really is these practices, which are ancient practices, really have many applications. And so I don't know, I guess that's what I would say is, don't give up hope, and maybe come and try some of the things that Adam and I are talking about that are really quite powerful.
That's fantastic. No, that is great insight, Sarah. I love that. And hope is, there's I guess the idea of hope, it just makes you feel like tomorrow is worth living for, right?
Right.
Because like you said, your dad would say, kind of just go to sleep. Tomorrow is a new day, and there always is new opportunity. So harnessing that and keeping that at the forefront of the mind, I think, is very powerful. You mentioned John Kabat-Zinn. We mentioned that on our last interview. I did not know he was a mentor of your. I think I read that you went through his training at UMass Medical, but that's fascinating. His book, Wherever You Go, There You Are, is so powerful. And I know he has some other publications.
Full Catastrophe, which I love also, because it's like his idea of that's his huge one that I read for one of my, it's like 400 or 500 pages, but it's, the idea is that in the midst of the full catastrophe of life,
Yep.
you can practice. And I love that term, because my life feels like the full catastrophe,
Yeah.
especially as a mother of four teenagers, it can really feel like the full catastrophe.
Oh, I'm sure.
Sometimes. Or when my father had his accident, or, whatever, different things, people around us are suffering. But I just want to say one other thing, which is that one analogy that I also really like from Buddhism is, and one of the reasons why I founded the Really Mindful group, why I decided to leave the law and do this, and actually say, I'm going to found this company and start bringing these practices to people like me, was because I feel profoundly drawn to try to help reduce the what we call the unnecessary suffering of others. So there's a sort of a story or a way of saying in Buddhism that you can't prevent bad things from happening in your life. I mean, we all know it. They happen when you least expect them. They happen to all of us. There's injury, there's death, there's all sorts of different things that can happen. But what you hopefully through these mindfulness practices, what you can learn through this daily practice that we've talked about, is to reduce the unnecessary suffering. And by that, the analogy is that a dart will get sent into our bodies. We're going to have these darts that will hurt us. Mm-hmm. But what we do when our mind starts going crazy and worrying and ruminating and thinking, I just want to, and I still do this, I just want to go back to yesterday before this happened. I don't want this to start. You trying to replay the world as if you could take time backwards. You're actually putting unnecessary extra darts, and you're making it extra painful for you. So for me, part of this practice, part of the reason of actually leaving the law, something that I really had a wonderful career doing, if stress-filled, was to help reduce other people's unnecessary suffering through these practices. And then also to give myself an excuse to increase my own practice, because, you learn and you grow through teaching. Definitely. And as part of being a teacher, I need to go to trainings regularly and practice regularly. So it was an ability to do what I know helps me so much, and to carve out a bigger portion of my life to this in service of others. Yes. And myself at the same time. And I like to say that I'm a perfectionist. It's like I would be at an AA meeting and I say, I'm Sarah and I'm a recovering perfectionist, is the way I call myself. And my husband's like, oh, you shouldn't use that term. It's really derogatory or whatever. I'm like, well, I don't think of it as derogatory. I think of it as the simple term of like wanting, especially when I was the younger self of me, wanting to do things perfectly, wanting to do a perfect job. And I think I have been a recovering perfectionist for quite a period of years. Similar to being an alcoholic or other types of addicts, you don't just recover and wake up and, oh, I'm better. But to be on the path to recovery is pretty cool. For me, it's pretty optimistic. So I'm able to find wisdom to help me through the things that arise in my life. And I'm able to continually practice. And the practice itself, to me, isn't boring or painful. The practice is actually really, you have your better days and your worst days, but I love the practice. So I don't think of it as the drudgery of the practice, whereas practicing law, after a while, it felt more like drudgery because I was getting kind of more bored by doing the same things. And with this, it never feels like I'm doing the same thing because I'm out there helping people reduce their unnecessary suffering. I mean, if there isn't a motivating cause, I don't know. If that isn't a motivating cause, I don't know what would be. Yeah. So.
No, kudos to you. I like the term recovering perfectionist because I'll actually end there. I got one more question, then we'll see if any folks have any questions coming in. But all of us in some element, I believe, are perfectionists in one way or another. If we've ever wanted to perform a certain task, or if we've ever feared public speaking, and I think a large majority of our world fears it. In fact, there was a survey done years back that public speaking was number one on people's list, even ahead of dying, which leads me to believe that people are inherently perfectionists because they want everything to be so perfect that like no one can judge them, right? No one's going to be able to ridicule them. They want things to just go seamlessly because they're concerned about what people will think of them. So anyways, I say all that to say, Sarah, I know on your website, I laughed the first time I watched it in a good way because you said you ran against the former President Barack Obama at Harvard Law School. I think it was for president of the Harvard Law Review. And you've obviously been this type A, in again, a good way, a driven, motivated perfectionist who is now on this path of recovery, as you've said. So, for anyone who may feel like they've been where you've been, who would be audacious enough to run against the former president of the United States, for something prestigious like the Harvard Law Review, what would you say to them to help them still be high achievers, but maybe not be so focused on this perfection?
It's a great question. I mean, I guess I just would come back to, again, in my broken record fashion that I've talked about before, that it's really about the daily practice. Because and then I guess this is just a little side anecdote that's not really mindfulness, but that I've learned. A friend of mine was up for managing director at Morgan Stanley in London. And I guess they sent her off for a training, like a professional development training. And she came back, it was a week long, and she came back to it and she said, "Sarah, you're not going to believe what I learned in this training." And I was like, "What did you learn?" That's kind of crazy. They're sending you to say, you can become a managing director, but somehow you're hitting a wall. And she said, "Well, I learned that it was kind of like they were saying, and it was probably somewhat gender driven, that women tend to do this more than men, but it certainly could apply to lots of people, that in order to become managing director at Morgan Stanley, you need to work less." She was like, "Can you believe that they're telling me this?" And I was like, "Oh my God, that's so crazy." Because I always thought, certainly at Harvard Law School and at these other schools that I went to before, my achievement was driven by working harder than anyone. So no one could catch me, and I could get the best grades and have the highest performance. And if it was going to be public speaking, I would practice that. I made myself go out and start doing it. So the idea that you needed to work less to succeed was shocking at first. And then I reflected on it and I thought, okay, this is really interesting. I need to reflect on this. And what I realized, and also speaking with her, was that to succeed in the corporate world, it's not about doing the most work and doing it most perfectly. There's so many elements to it. And a big part of it is leadership. It's about relationships. It's about spending time in the hallways, talking to people, connecting with people, listening to people. And when I was in my real, younger me, really trying to climb that ladder, I didn't do enough of that. And I think there are some people who go right in and start doing that golfing and really like doing more of the networking, and they kind of said to her, "This is what you need to succeed here." And for me, it was a lesson. And then I started reflecting even more, and I realized, you know what, my 80% job is probably over 100% for many people. So if I can actually, and it's not to recommend underperforming, but if I can take it down a few notches, like not proofread it that extra time, and use that time to call someone and connect with someone, or go in the office and go walk around and chat with some of the people who are assisting us, who don't feel valued or appreciated, or whatever it might be, have coffee with someone, that's actually more valuable. So for me, that was really kind of like wow moment in my life as a younger lawyer. And I think that's an example where perfectionism, it's not the answer always. And I also think, again, perfectionism for me was this constant self-critical drive, which by letting go of that and relaxing and allowing myself the freedom to just be more kind of loving of myself, I think I became a more fun person to be around. And one thing, I'll end with one note, which is that when I switched from being lawyer to being business person, entrepreneur, salesperson, trainer, doing all these different roles.
You wear all the hats as an entrepreneur.
Yeah, you wear all the hats. And I feel like it was actually wonderful, because as a lawyer, I felt like I was talk about expert kind of thing. I was in this narrow role. Like especially when I worked as a lawyer in Europe, they didn't want you as a lawyer trying to negotiate or be a business person. They're like, no, vous êtes avocat, or whatever. Like, you're not supposed to do this other type of negotiating or whatever.
Yeah.
And in America, at least, we're a little more open about job descriptions, and lawyers do a lot of different things typically. But I think that I just realized that for me, as in my job as a lawyer, even though I had a pretty cool career in sports law and all these living in Europe and working around the world, that I still felt like I was using 10% or 20% of my capacity. It's like a phone where you don't, you use such a little. I'm a bad user of this technology because there's so much of it. I don't do all the trainings and I don't use a lot of it. My kids teach me all these cool things that you can do. But similarly, I felt like these companies weren't getting much out of me from what I had to offer. And then when I became an entrepreneur, it was tapping into all these sides of me, which was really, I don't know, I felt engaged. I felt energized. I felt really, I don't know. It was a great way to be. And the other thing, just the funny anecdote, is that I feel like when I would go to cocktail parties or dinner parties, my husband is more in venture and he like constantly is meeting people and he does interesting stuff. And I would go and say, I'm a lawyer, even though I was a lawyer for the NBA or Reebok. And it kind of, they're interested in the athletes and stuff, but there's not as much to talk about. And now that I switched to becoming an entrepreneur and teaching mindfulness, people want to talk to me because there's a lot of people curious about this. And I remember going to my law school reunion. It was my, 25th or 30th from Harvard Law School. And the dean I was connecting with my classmates and telling them that I was no longer a lawyer. I was now had this company bringing mindfulness, and they were so curious and so interested. And I saw the dean of the entire law school, Martha Minow, and I said, I used to be your teaching assistant and I was in law for 23 years. And now I have my own company. I'm teaching mindfulness on Wall Street. And she's like, Wall Street? You need to come teach that at Harvard Law School. And I was like, okay, what do I need to do? And she said, well, email me Monday morning. And sure enough, I emailed her and I got a gig and whatever. I was like, this is great. This is definitely, people find me more fun and interesting. So that's good. When you're following your passion, that happens. So
I certainly do. And I didn't know the Sarah prior to entrepreneurship. So I only have one to judge from, but I have very much enjoyed not only speaking with you today, but having gotten to know you over the past years. And today, however, was incredible. You did an amazing job answering what can be some tough questions. So thank you so much, Sarah. I know we've already gone over a time. If there's anyone who has any questions, please feel free to put it in the chat box. I know somebody loved your story. They had commented. So if we don't have any questions, we'll hang tight for just about 15 or 20 more seconds. But if there's any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. And this was amazing, Sarah. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. And if anyone has questions, you can also, my email, sarah@realllymindfulgroup.com, is on my website, which is realllymindfulgroup.com. So you can find information about my trainings, but also if you want to email me with any questions that come to you after this ends, feel free, or when you're watching the recording. So thank you.
Perfect. Yeah, thanks for sharing. I'll be sure to blast out another note to the community and then on social media as well with your contact info. So, well, it looks like that's going to conclude for today. But again, thank you for those who tuned in and those who watch on demand. Thank you for taking the time when you will watch. And Sarah, thank you again. I look forward to talking soon.
Me too. Take care. Bye, Adam.